My name is Margaret Elkins, but most people just call me Maggie. I turned 63 this morning, and for the first time in years, I didn't dread it. The air was cool, the sun filtered through the kitchen blinds just right, and the kettle was singing on the stove like it always does. Birthdays aren't a big deal anymore, not since Sophie moved out west and the house grew quiet. I made myself some tea, let the cat out, and shuffled to the front door to grab the paper. That's when I saw it. A card on the floor just inside the door frame. No envelope, no stamp, just my name in handwriting I hadn't seen in over 2 decades. At first, I thought maybe it was from Sophie. She's sentimental like that, always writing little notes trying to make things feel special, even from far away. But the handwriting, it wasn't hers. My chest tightened the second I picked it up. I knew that slant the way the letters curled at the edges. It was David's, and just like that, my breath caught in my throat. I walked to the kitchen table, sat down slowly, and stared at the card like it might vanish. It was one of those generic ones, pale yellow with a watercolor flower on the front. Peaceful, ordinary. But my hands were trembling as I opened it. Inside were 8 words scrawled in blue ink that had begun to fade. Happy birthday, Maggie. I never left. Check the attic. I read it once, then again, and again. My heart was pounding so loudly I could hear it over the ticking clock on the wall. I felt the room tilt. I thought maybe I was dizzy, maybe the heat was too high or I hadn't eaten. But no, it wasn't my body failing me. It was something else, something deeper, a crack in reality, the kind of crack that lets the past slip through sharp and uninvited. David had been gone for 22 years, vanished one October morning and never came home. Everyone said he was dead. The police found his car, his keys, his wallet, but no body, no goodbye, just a question that never stopped echoing. I never left. I whispered the words to myself, barely a breath. I felt cold all over, not the kind of cold that makes you reach for a blanket, the kind that sits in your bones, heavy, familiar, dread with a hint of hope, which is always the most dangerous kind. I looked across the living room, past the bookshelf, past the photograph of Sophie as a teenager. My eyes landed on the narrow hallway that led to the attic stairs. I hadn't been up there since before David disappeared. Never needed to. Never wanted to. But now, I couldn't look away. The card was still in my hand, my tea had gone cold. My body sat still, but my mind raced, spiraling through years of memories, questions the hundreds of times I told myself to let it go, to move on, to stop wondering. I stood up slowly as if any sudden movement might break the spell. I walked to the hallway and stopped at the bottom of the attic stairs. The door was shut, the brass knob untouched, dusty. I reached for it, then let my hand fall back to my side. Instead, I just stood there staring at the door, frozen in the space between what I thought I knew and whatever waited above. David and I met in college, both of us too shy to make the first move, but somehow always sitting near each other in the campus coffee shop. He had this calm way about him, like nothing could rattle him. That steadiness drew me in. We weren't one of those couples who lit up a room or finished each other's sentences, but we fit. Quietly, naturally. We got married in the spring of '78. The ceremony was simple, just close friends and family in a garden behind his aunt's house. I remember the tulips blooming and how he looked at me during the vows like the world was narrowing in on just that moment. We moved into a modest 2-story house just outside Pittsburgh, the kind with faded shutters and a maple tree that brushed against the upstairs window in fall. Our life together was never dramatic. It was built around little things. Saturday morning pancakes, crossword puzzles on the porch grocery lists, written in his blocky handwriting. He always brought home the same brand of coffee. I always folded the towels the wrong way, and he never corrected me. We had a rhythm that made the years glide by. Sophie came along in '84. She was spirited from the start, all questions and wild hair. David adored her. He read her the same bedtime story every night for 3 years, never skipping a page even when he had the flu. When she was 10 and decided she wanted to be a paleontologist, he built her a sandbox just so she could pretend to dig for bones. I still remember the way he would hum while doing the dishes some off-key tune he picked up from an old record, or how he'd wait until I fell asleep before turning off the bedroom light just so I wouldn't have to. We weren't romantic in the grand sense, but we were loyal, solid. I believe that was enough. In those early years, I never imagined losing him. Not to something sudden or violent, certainly not to silence. We had our share of arguments, of course, usually about the thermostat or what to do with Sophie's college fund, but we always made up before bed. That was one of our rules. By 2001, Sophie was in her second year at NYU. We had settled into a quiet phase of life. David had taken up birdwatching. I was volunteering at the local library. We spent most evenings side by side on the couch, me knitting or reading him, scribbling notes in the margins of whatever biography he was devouring that week. It was ordinary, but it felt safe. That October morning, I woke up before him. I remember it was chilly and the light came in soft through the blinds. He got out of bed, kissed the top of my head, and said he was going to the hardware store. We needed paint for the upstairs bathroom. I asked him to pick up some more light bulbs, the ones with the soft white glow. He smiled and said, of course. I made toast and sat down to write a grocery list. It was nothing special. Laundry detergent, apples, maybe a pie crust, if I was in the mood to bake. An hour passed, then two. I figured he'd run into someone or stopped for coffee. That wasn't unusual, but by lunchtime I started to glance out the window more often. By 2 o'clock, I called his cell. It rang twice, then went to voicemail. I left a message, cheerful but a little worried. By 4, I was pacing. I checked the garage, thinking maybe I'd missed the sound of the car. But it was empty. His jacket was gone. So were his keys. But his wallet sat untouched on the entryway table. I tried again at 5, then 6. No answer. I made dinner but couldn't eat. Just sat there staring at the mashed potatoes until they went cold. At 7, I called Sophie. I told her not to worry, but even as I said the words, I could hear something strange in my own voice. A tightness. A crack. By 10, I'd called the hospital. Then the police. They said it was too soon, that sometimes people step out and forget to call. I knew David. He didn't forget. He wasn't the kind of man who just wandered off. That night, I slept on the couch with the front porch light on. I woke up every hour thinking I heard his car in the driveway. The next morning, I filed a missing person report. The officer was kind, but there was something in his eyes. Like he'd seen this before. Like he already had a theory. They asked for a recent photo. I gave them the one from our last vacation. David in a windbreaker smiling by a lake. It didn't even look like someone who would leave. 2 days later, they found his car abandoned in a wooded area off Route 19. It was locked. Keys inside. The glove box still held his reading glasses. No note, no blood, no sign of struggle. Just an empty car in the middle of nowhere. The police leaned toward suicide. They said sometimes people plan these things quietly. They find a place they leave behind their lives and no one ever really knows why. But that didn't sound like David. He wasn't restless. He wasn't depressed. He clipped coupons and watched documentaries about ancient history. He remembered to send birthday cards to his second cousins. He planned things. He didn't just vanish. Still, the story stuck. Friends sent casseroles. My sister flew in from Indiana and stayed for a week. The church held a candlelight vigil. People hugged me and whispered how strong I was. I didn't feel strong. I felt hollow. I didn't hold a funeral. Not yet. I couldn't. Something inside me kept saying, wait. Maybe he had a breakdown. Maybe he got lost. Maybe he was in a hospital confused trying to find his way home. I told myself every version except the one that would let me say goodbye. And so the years passed. The house grew quieter. Sophie called every Sunday, but even she stopped asking after a while. The bedroom closet still held his coats. The bathroom drawer still had his shaving cream. I couldn't touch any of it. I lived around the absence, not through it. I thought I had made peace with not knowing. I thought silence was safer than digging. Until today. Until that card. Until someone who shouldn't have known how to find me wrote in the handwriting I could never forget and told me he never left. It was a Tuesday, October 9th, 2001. The leaves had just started turning and the air had that crisp, quiet feeling I always loved. David came downstairs with his coffee half full and said he was going to get paint for the upstairs bathroom. I reminded him to grab light bulbs, and he nodded, smiling as he slipped on his jacket. His last words to me were about paint and how he'd be back before lunch. I didn't think twice about it at the time. That's the part that haunts me. How easy it was to let him walk out the door. I went about my morning, fed the cat, loaded the dishwasher, opened the windows to let in some air. It was peaceful the way mornings usually are in this house. I made a list for the store, called Sophie to ask how her midterms were going, and started folding laundry while an old radio show hummed in the background. Noon came and he wasn't back. I figured maybe he'd stopped to chat with Bill at the hardware store or ran into someone at the diner. He did that sometimes, but by 1 o'clock I started watching the driveway a little too often. The cat sat by the window flicking her tail. I kept telling myself it was nothing. By 2, I called his phone. It rang twice, then went to voicemail. I left a short message, just checking in, wondering if he needed anything else from town. My voice sounded normal, almost cheerful. I didn't feel normal. I waited another hour before calling again. No answer. That's when my stomach started to twist. At 4, I drove to the hardware store. No one remembered seeing him. The clerk at the register said they hadn't had anyone in asking about bathroom paint that morning. I left and tried the grocery store, the post office, even the little gas station on the corner. Nothing. I drove every road I could think of between here and town, calling his phone every 15 minutes like a ritual. Each time it went straight to voicemail, my hands gripped the wheel tighter. By the time I got home, the sun was slipping behind the trees. The house felt too still. His slippers were by the back door, the kind he never left home without in colder months. His wallet was still sitting on the hallway table. I called the police just after 8. They told me it was too early to file a report, but they took my information anyway. The officer's voice was kind, but I heard the hesitation. Like maybe he thought this wasn't urgent. Like maybe he thought I was overreacting. That night, I didn't sleep. I left the porch light on, sat by the window with a blanket wrapped around my shoulders, watching every car that passed. I kept thinking I'd see headlights, that he'd come back with a bag of paint and some story about running into someone. I pictured him opening the door like nothing had happened. But the door stayed shut. Every hour that passed felt heavier than the one before. The next morning, I drove to every place we'd ever gone together. The park, the bookstore, even the old cafe that had closed down 2 years earlier. I stopped strangers on the street, showed them a photo from my wallet, asked if they'd seen him. Most shook their heads. A few just looked down, unsure what to say. The police called 2 days later. They'd found his car. It was parked off a narrow dirt road in a wooded area about 30 miles north. I drove out with one of the officers. The car looked untouched, locked. The keys were in the ignition. His jacket lay folded on the passenger seat. His reading glasses and wallet were in the glove box. The car battery had died. There was no note, no footprints, no signs of struggle. I stood there staring at that car like it could answer me. Like if I just looked long enough, the truth would materialize. I kept thinking maybe he got out to walk and fell. Maybe he was still close. They sent out search dogs. A small crew combed the woods for hours. They didn't find anything. The official theory was suicide, that maybe he'd chosen this place for its quiet, that sometimes people plan to disappear without telling anyone. But I couldn't believe it, not without a body, not without goodbye. David wasn't impulsive, he wasn't dramatic. He was the kind of man who balanced the checkbook to the penny and packed extra napkins in the glove compartment. I couldn't see him just vanishing like that. But I had nothing else to go on. No evidence, no closure, just a car in the woods and a silence that began to fill every corner of my life. I went home that night and sat on our bed for hours, fully dressed, staring at the empty space where he should have been. I thought I would cry, but I didn't. I just waited. And waited. Like somehow, the waiting might bring him back. The hardest part wasn't that he was gone. It was that he disappeared without explanation, without a goodbye, without giving me anything solid to hold on to except an old car and silence. People talk about grief like it has steps, but I never found them. I just floated. We held a memorial 3 weeks after the search ended. There was no casket, just a framed photo of David on a stand smiling at a picnic we once took in West Virginia. The church was full, and people I hadn't seen in years showed up with casseroles and condolences. I don't remember most of what they said, only that their hugs felt too warm, too certain, like they needed the ritual more than I did. My sister flew in and stayed for a while. She cleaned the kitchen, sorted the mail, tried to make me eat. Sophie called twice a day back then. Her voice wobbled when she asked if I was okay. I always said yes because saying no felt like letting her fall into the same pit I was in, but I wasn't okay, not even close. The first thing I stopped doing was answering the door. I didn't want to explain again. I didn't want to hear that maybe it was better not to know. That time would heal. Time didn't feel like anything at all, just days passing. The second thing I stopped doing was tending the garden. The petunias withered. The weeds moved in like they had a right to be there. I lived off tea and crackers, sometimes nothing. The fridge slowly filled with untouched leftovers that neighbors dropped off. I thanked them. Then I let their food rot behind the orange juice. I slept in short, broken stretches. The house creaked in ways it never had before. Every sound felt like maybe it was him just outside, finally ready to come home. I avoided the attic completely. Couldn't even look at the hallway that led to it. Something about that space always felt too close to memory, too filled with shadows. I told myself there was nothing up there worth the ache, just dusty boxes and forgotten Christmas decorations. I didn't move anything of his. His shoes stayed by the door, his coat hung in the closet, still carrying the shape of his shoulders. I started to hate the way everything in the house remained untouched, like it was holding its breath. Just like me, waiting. Sometimes I caught myself talking to him, out loud, short things. You'd laugh at that, or I found your glasses again, then silence. Not even the comfort of imagining his voice answering back, just the hollow quiet that settled deeper every week. I wasn't living. I was waiting for someone to tell me which way was forward. No one ever did. I waited until the sun started to go down, the light always softened around, then casting long shadows across the floor. I stood at the base of the attic stairs with the card still in my hand. The words burned into my mind. I never left. Check the attic. My heart felt too loud in my chest, like it was trying to warn me or push me forward. I grabbed the flashlight from the kitchen drawer, the one I hadn't touched in years. The steps creaked louder than I remembered. Each one stretched with my weight, protesting like it knew I didn't belong up there anymore. The air changed the moment I opened the door, cooler, still. It smelled like dust and wood and time that had stood still too long. I held the flashlight out in front of me, the beam shaky but steady enough to see old trunks boxes, labeled with faded Sharpie forgotten holiday bins. My breath came shallow as I stepped deeper in. The floorboards groaned beneath me, and every sound made me flinch. I kept telling myself it was just an attic, just storage. But something about the stillness felt different, like the room was waiting for me, like it knew. Near the far wall, behind a stack of broken lamps and torn suitcases, I saw it. A section of paneling that looked newer than the rest, cleaner. The wood didn't match. My hands were shaking as I reached out and pressed against it. Nothing happened at first. I pressed again harder this time. Then came a soft pop. The panel gave slightly. I pulled it back with both hands and found a shallow space behind it. Inside was a chest, old metal corners, scratched surface. I dragged it out and sat beside it on the dusty floor, legs trembling. The latch was stiff but opened with a sharp snap. Inside were manila folders, loose papers, photos, and stacks tied with rubber bands gone brittle with age. I reached for one photo near the top. The man was smiling, standing in front of what looked like a playground. He had his arm around a woman I didn't know. Dark hair, wide smile. There were two children in the picture, a boy and a girl, maybe 7 or 8. One had their hand in his, the other sat on his shoulders. I stared at the man's face, the way his eyes crinkled when he smiled. The shape of his nose. It was David. I didn't move. I couldn't. I pulled out another photo. This time he was barbecuing in a backyard. Same woman, same kids. Another showed him at a school play, wearing a button-up shirt I'd never seen before. He looked happy, like the life I once shared with him had never existed, like I had been erased. There were letters, dozens of them, addresses I didn't recognize, a driver's license with a new name, Jonathan Reed, same face, different man. I couldn't stop shaking. I felt the weight of every year I had spent wondering, mourning, freezing my life in place while he had simply rewritten his. I sat there on the attic floor, surrounded by a life I never knew existed. The flashlight rolled slightly, casting shadows across the beams. I didn't cry. I just held the photo tighter, letting the betrayal settle into my bones like the cold. The truth had been here the whole time, tucked above me, breathing in the silence. I laid everything out on the attic floor, photo after photo, a timeline of a life I was never part of. David smiling beside that woman year after year, the children growing older in each picture, birthday parties, beach trips, school plays, moments he should have lived with Sophie and me. There were letters too, dozens of them, folded with care, written in the same handwriting I once knew by heart. He signed them, Dad. He wrote about his job, about the dog they adopted, about how proud he was of the kids. I read one twice, then a third time just to feel the reality settle in. He hadn't died. He hadn't been taken from me. He had walked away and built something else. He had started over, changed his name, wiped away his old life like it had never mattered. While I lit candles at a memorial service, he was teaching his son how to ride a bike. While I sat through winter after winter alone, he was building a swing set in a backyard I'd never see. He chose that, every bit of it. My grief hadn't been for a man who was lost. It had been for a man who wanted to disappear, who knew what it would do to me and did it anyway. I thought I'd buried a husband, but all I'd really buried was the story he let me believe. I felt something shift inside me. Not a scream, not tears, just a deep burn, quiet and slow, like fire starting in a locked room. I didn't shout, I didn't throw anything. I just sat there with the box in my lap and let the truth settle into every corner of me. He left, on purpose, and I had survived it without even knowing. The morning after I found the box, I stood in the kitchen and made scrambled eggs, not because I was hungry, but because I needed to feel my hands doing something familiar. The smell filled the house in a way that reminded me I was still here, still alive. I sat at the table and ate slowly without distraction, letting the silence be just silence for once, not a question mark. I pulled out an old journal from the hallway drawer. The leather was cracked, the pages stiff. I hadn't written in years. At first, the words came out in fragments. A thought here, a sentence there, then whole pages started to fill. I wrote about the attic, about the anger, about the years I had spent frozen in place while life moved around me. It didn't make the pain disappear, but it helped me name it. I opened the windows in the living room, let the spring air move through the curtains. The house had held its breath long enough. Dust floated in the light, and for the first time in years, I didn't flinch when I saw it. I vacuumed. I changed the sheets. I washed the curtains that hadn't been touched since Sophie moved out. I didn't rush. I just moved at my own pace. David's shoes were still by the door. I picked them up and placed them in a box along with the coat he used to wear on our Sunday walks. I filled 3 more boxes with his books, his old tools, his things I'd let sit untouched for too long. I didn't cry. I didn't need to. The act of clearing made room for something new. I brought fresh flowers into the house, daisies. They weren't my favorite, but they felt simple and clean. I started planning meals again, ones I actually looked forward to eating. I walked around the neighborhood in the evenings just far enough to feel my legs working again. The rhythm of it gave me something to return to. In the attic, I swept out the dust and boxed up the rest of what I'd found. I labeled it all and slid it into the back of the closet, not to forget but to contain. I wasn't trying to erase him. I was making space for myself. I bought a small reading lamp and placed it in the corner where the chest had been. Added a chair, a rug, a quiet place to sit and breathe. I didn't talk about it to anyone, not yet. It felt like something I needed to carry on my own until it felt lighter. But little by little, I stopped living inside the story he left me. I started shaping one of my own, not perfect, not flashy, but mine. And when I looked around the house and saw the windows open, the shelves, dusted the flowers on the table, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. I felt home. I called a private investigator the following Monday. Her name was Dana. She didn't ask many questions, just listened as I explained what I had found. I handed her a folder with the photographs, the letters, the driver's license. She nodded once and said she'd be in touch. There was nothing dramatic about it, just 2 women sitting at a diner booth exchanging quiet truths. The waiting didn't make me anxious. It made me still, like I was watching something settle into place inside myself. I kept cooking, kept walking, kept writing in the journal. There was power in the routine. 1 week later, Dana called. She had a name, a location. David was alive, living in Omaha under the name Stephen Granger, married with 2 children, a dog, a mortgage. I didn't cry. I didn't yell. I just sat at the kitchen table and let the words come into me, one by one. David Elkins was not dead. He had been living a new life while I stayed frozen in the old one. That was the truth. And the truth for once felt like something I could hold. I didn't want revenge. I didn't need drama. I just needed to see him, to look him in the face and say I knew, not for him, for me. I chose the park because it felt neutral. Open space, nothing to hide behind. The kind of place where silence didn't feel heavy, just part of the breeze. I got there early and sat on a bench near the creek, watching the water move past the stones. My hands rested in my lap. I didn't bring anything with me. No folder, no photos, just myself. He arrived exactly on time. I saw him from a distance walking slowly down the path. His posture was familiar. So was the way he looked down at the ground between steps, like the world might slip if he didn't keep his eyes on it. His hair was thinner, his face fuller, but the lines around his eyes were the same. I didn't move, just watched. When he saw me, he hesitated. 1 step caught mid-stride, then he kept coming. He sat beside me without a word, left space between us, the kind of space that had once grown between our dinners. We didn't speak at first, just listened to the wind, birds in the trees, a child laughing somewhere in the distance. Finally, he said he didn't know how to begin. I told him he already had. The day he walked away, he nodded like he expected that, like he had been practicing for it. Then the explanation started, soft and scattered, words like pressure, collapse, guilt. He said he had felt like he couldn't breathe, that something in him had broken, that leaving had felt like the only option. I listened. I didn't interrupt. I watched his hands more than his face. They twisted in his lap the same way they used to when he was nervous. He told me he was sorry, that he thought about me every day, that he had tried to forget, but never really could. His voice cracked only once. I told him I didn't hate him. That would have been too easy. I told him I had mourned him longer than I had loved him, that I had built a life on top of a lie and still found a way to breathe. I said I forgave him, but I would never forget. He nodded again, eyes wet but no tears fell. We sat there for another few minutes. The breeze moved through the trees like it had somewhere else to be. I stood first. He didn't try to follow. I walked away with steady steps, no drama, no backward glance, just the quiet of my own truth wrapped around me like something finally earned. I stood slowly smoothing my coat as I did. The weight of everything he had said settled quietly in the space between us. He looked up at me, eyes searching for something I didn't owe him anymore. I held his gaze without anger, just truth. I told him I forgave him, because I needed to, not for him, for me, but I also told him I would never forget. Not the years I spent waiting, not the quiet dinners alone, not the version of myself that shrank in his absence. He nodded once like he understood what that meant. Maybe he did, maybe he didn't. That wasn't mine to carry anymore. There was nothing more to say. I turned and walked away. My steps were even. No rush, no hesitation. The breeze brushed my face as I left the park path behind. Each step felt like a small release. I reached my car and sat for a moment before turning the key. The engine hummed low, steady. I didn't cry. I didn't look back. There was nothing there for me anymore. Just a man I used to know sitting on a bench under a soft sky. I drove home in silence, not needing music or distraction, just the road and the quiet inside me. And for the first time in years, the silence didn't feel empty. It felt like peace. The attic looks different now. The old chest is gone. I donated most of what was inside. The panel has been sealed not to forget, but because I no longer need to check behind it. In its place, there's a soft chair, a warm lamp, and a shelf with my favorite books. I come up here most evenings with peppermint tea and a blanket. It's quiet but not heavy anymore. I hung a painting on the wall. A landscape, nothing special, just a field and a tree under a wide sky. It feels like breath, like a space that lets me be still. The attic used to be full of ghosts. Now it's full of light. I didn't plan for it to become my favorite room. It just happened that way. My days are simple, but they're mine. I wake early, I open the curtains. I walk around the block after breakfast, nodding at neighbors I never took the time to meet before. I cook real meals again, not just toaster crackers, real food with seasoning and sides and little garnishes. I set the table for one and light a candle, not because I'm pretending someone else will join me, but because I want it to feel like care. The garden is growing again. I pulled up the weeds, planted herbs and tomatoes, and a few wildflowers that don't need much attention. I talk to them sometimes quietly. It feels nice to speak into the air without needing an answer. Sometimes I think about what could have been, but it doesn't ache the way it used to. The sadness has edges now, and inside those edges is space for other things. One afternoon, Sophie called just to check in. Her voice sounded bright, full of some story about a coworker's dog. Then she paused, said I sounded different, lighter. I smiled and told her maybe I am. I meant it. She didn't ask for more. She just laughed and said she'd call again soon. I still have the journal. I still write. Not about him anymore. About me, my thoughts, what I notice, what I hope for, sometimes what I forgive. I don't write with urgency now, just rhythm, like breathing. I've learned that healing doesn't announce itself. It moves in slowly like sunrise behind clouds. And one morning you wake up and realize you've made it through something you thought would break you. No one claps. There's no applause, just a steadiness in your chest that wasn't there before. I didn't get revenge. I didn't burn anything down, but I did reclaim something: my name, my time, the sound of my own voice in a quiet house. I found power in a place he thought he had left behind, and I didn't scream to get it back. Because sometimes the loudest thing you can do is live, and sometimes the most lasting power is the truth you carry quietly, the one that doesn't need to be shouted, only lived.